Hello everyone. Today we are going to learn about connection. In the context of neural networks, a connection refers to the link between neurons in different layers of the network. Connection links the output of one neuron to the input of another neuron. So here in this exercise, this is the input layer which receives the initial data, and this is the output layer which produces the final output. So for the simplicity of understanding, we will consider that x1 and x2, that means the input can be any values and the bias also can be any value. Also, we don't care about the output. So output can also be any kind of values. And let's consider the weights as non-zero values. And for the simplicity, we will consider the weights as simply 1. So here you can see that this value of x1 will get multiplied by this w1. So x1 will have a connection with y because the input x1 will get multiplied by the weight and the information of x1 will pass to y. Similarly, the information of x2 will also get multiplied by this one, and we will have the effect of x2 on the output y. So we will get also a connection from x2 to y. So for the next exercise, we can see that the first weight is 0. That means the information of x1 doesn't go to y because x1 will get multiplied by this 0 and the value will be 0. So no information of x1 will go to y. So there will be no connection from x1 to y, but x2 will get multiplied by 1 and x2 will have an effect on the output of y. So x2 will have a connection to y. In the next exercise, you can see that we have only one input here, but we have two outputs here. So x1 will have the effect of its information to y1 because the value here is non-zero, or we can say the value is 1. So we will get a connection from x1 to y1. Again, this value of x1 will get multiplied by this value of the weight, and then it will have the effect of its value to y2. So we will get a connection from x1 to y2 also. For the next exercise, it's similar to the previous one. The only difference is that it's 0. So x1 will have no effect on y1. So we don't get any connection from x1 to y1. But from x1 to y2, we will have its effect. So there will be a connection from x1 to y2. Next exercise, we will have the effect of x1 to this y1, but no effect on y2. So we will get a connection from only x1 to y1, not x1 to y2. Next example, we have three inputs, x1, x2, and x3, and only one output, which is y. So x1 will get multiplied to this w1. So it's 0. So x1 will have no effect on y, but x2 will get multiplied with this one, x3 will get multiplied with this one. So we will have effect of x2 and x3 on y. So x2 and x3 will be connected to y. There will be no link from x1 to y. Again, for the next exercise, we won't have any connection from x2 to y because the value of w2 is 0. So x1 will have its effect on y, and x3 will have its effect on y. So we will only get the link from x1 to y and x3 to y. So for the next example, x1 will get multiplied with this and x2 will get multiplied with this. So when x1 is multiplied with this value, x1 will have no effect on y1. But when we multiply this x2 by this value, we will have an impact on y1. So we will get a link from x2 to y1. So x2 goes to y1. And for this row, we will see that x1 will get multiplied with this one. So we will have an impact from x1 to y2. So x1 to y2. But when this x2 gets multiplied by this 0, we will have no effect. So there will be no link from x2 to y2. The next exercise again, x1 gets multiplied with this one. So x1 will have effect on y1. So x1 gets a link from x1 to y1, but x2 gets multiplied by 0 and will have no effect on y1. For the next row, x1 will get multiplied by this 0, so will have no effect on y2, but x2 will get multiplied by this 1, so x2 will have effect on y2. Then the next exercise. X1 gets multiplied by this one, X2 gets multiplied by this one. So X1 and X2 will both have effects for Y1. So we will put links from X1 to Y1 and then X2 to Y1. And for the next row of weights, we can see that X1 will get multiplied by this one and X2 will get multiplied by this one. So both X1 and X2 will have effects on Y2. So we will get connections from X1 to Y2 and X2 to Y2. So we can see that here we get a more complex connection, or we can say it's a fully connected network. So every input is connected with every output. The next exercise, you can see that these x1, x2, and x3, all the three inputs will be multiplied by these three ones, and we will have impact of all these three inputs on y1. So we can just get a link from x1 to y1, x2 to y1, and x3 to y1. But for this row, you can see that all the weights values are 0. So we will have no connection from x1, x2, x3 to y2. So this will be our final connections. Then the next exercise, you can see all these three input values gets multiplied by 0, and thus these three inputs will have no connection to y1. So we don't get links or connections from x1, x2, x3 to y1. But for these three values, they are getting multiplied by 3 ones in case of y2. So we will get a connection from x1 to y2, x2 to y2, and x3 to y2. We can simply say that whatever the values are for x1, x2, and x3, it doesn't affect y1. Then for the next exercise, these three inputs, we can say that only x2 gets multiplied by 1 for y1. So we will have a connection from x2 to y1. And then for this row, again, only x2 gets multiplied by 1 here for y2. So x2 will also get a connection from x2 to y2. So this is the final connection for this exercise. Now for this exercise, only x3 gets multiplied by 1 in case of y1. So x3 will get a connection from x3 to y1. And again, for the next row of weights, only this x3 gets multiplied by this one for y2. So x3 will get a connection from x3 to y2. Next exercise, for the first row, only x2 gets multiplied by a weight which affects y1. So x2 will get connected to y1. And then for the next row of weights, x1 gets multiplied by the weight and x3 gets multiplied by the weight in case of y2. So x1 will get connected to y2 and this x3 will get connected to y2. Next, we have 3 rows of weights and 2 inputs. So this x1 gets multiplied by this 0, so no effect of y1. x2 will get multiplied by the weight, so it will have an effect of y1. So we can connect x2 to y1. So x2 will get connected to y1. For this row, x1 and x2 will not affect y2 because both the weights are 0. So let's look at the next row. So this row, x1 gets multiplied by this one. So x1 only will have effect of y3 because the next weight is 0. So x1 will get connected to y3. Next, we can see that for all the rows of weights, one gets multiplied by these zeros in all cases. So only x2 will have effect on y1, y2, y3 because x2 is getting multiplied by 1 in these all cases. So we can simply connect x2 to y1, x2 to y2, x2 to y3. Next exercise, x1 will get multiplied by this one in case of y1 and rest of the values are 0. So x2 and x3 will have no effect on y1. So x1 only gets connected to y1. Then for this row, x2 gets multiplied by this one. So x2 only will affect y2. So x2 gets connected to y2. And then for this row, x3 gets multiplied by this one. So it will only affect y3. So x3 gets connection to y3. Next exercise, you can see all the weights for the output value of y1 is 0 and for the output value of y2 is 0. So we will get no connection from all these three inputs to y2 and 1. We will just get the connections from x1 to y3 because the value is 1 here, x2 to y3 because this value is 1 here, x3 to y3 because this value is also 1 here. So we can simply draw x1 has an effect on y3, x2 has an effect on y3, and x3 has an effect on y3. That means this output will have effects on the change of all the input values x1, x2, and x3. Next, you can see that x1 will have an effect on y1. So x1 gets a connection to y1. Then for the next row, again, x1 gets multiplied by this one. So x1 will have an effect on y2 also. So x1 goes to y2. And then for the third row, again, x1 will get multiplied by this one. So x1 will have an effect on y3. So x1 gets connected to y3 again. Next, for this row, x3 gets multiplied by this one, so x3 will have an effect on y1. Then for the second row, only x2 gets multiplied by this one, so it will have an effect on y2. So x2 gets connected to y2. And then for the last row, x1 gets multiplied by this one. So the input x1 will have an impact on y3. So x1 gets connected to y. Next, we have 5 rows of weights and 5 outputs and 3 inputs. So for the first row, none of the inputs will have an impact on y1. So y1 doesn't get connected with any of the inputs, but for y2, only x1 gets to be multiplied with 1. So y2 will get connected with x1. And then for the next row, x2 will be multiplied by 1 for y3. So x2 gets a connection to y3. And then for the next row, this 1 gets multiplied by x3. So x3 will have an impact on y4. So we connect x3 to y4. And for the last row, none of the inputs have an impact because all the weights are 0 for y5. Next, for the first 2 rows, that means for the output of y1 and y2, none of the inputs have an impact. But for this row, x1 gets multiplied by 1, x2 gets multiplied by 1, and x3 gets multiplied by 1. So all the 3 inputs are getting multiplied by some weights. So all the 3 inputs will have an impact on the output y3. So x1 gets a connection to y3, x2 gets a connection to y3, and x3 gets a connection to y3. And for the last 2 rows, again, there is no impact on x1, x2, and x3 to y4 and y5. So we don't get any connection from x1, x2, x3 to y4 and y5. Next example, we can see that only x2 gets multiplied with this value for y1. So x2 will get connection to y1. And again, this x2 will get multiplied by this one for y2. So x2 will get a connection to y2. Then again, x2 gets multiplied by this 1 for y3. So x2 will get a connection to y3. x2 will again get multiplied by 1 in case of y4. So x2 will get a connection to y4. And at last, again, x2 will get multiplied by this one in case of y5. So x2 again gets a connection to y5. So it means that for all the 5 outputs, only we will see a change if the value of x2 changes. If x1 and x3 changes, we will see no impact for these 5 outputs. For the last example, we can see in the first row for the output of y1, none of the input has impact. So we don't get a connection from x1, x2, x3 to y1. For the second row, x1 gets multiplied by this one, x2 gets multiplied by this one. So x1 and x2 will get a connection to y2. So x1 and x2 gets connected to y2. And then for the third row, none of the inputs will have an impact on y3, so we don't get any connection for y3. Next row, again, we don't have any impacts of these 3 inputs to y4 because all the weight values are 0. So we don't get any connection to y4 from all these 3 inputs. But for y5, this x2 and x3 gets multiplied by 1. So x2 and x3 will have a connection to y5. So from this video, I hope you can understand how connections work in between neural networks. So connections in a neural network are fundamental to its ability to learn and generalize from data. By adjusting these weights and the biases of these connections, the network can learn complex patterns and relationships within the data. Overall, connections in a neural network are fundamental components that enable the network to learn and make predictions by transmitting and transforming information through its structure. I hope you find this video helpful. Thank you.